My name is Rukmini Iyer, and I'm based in Mumbai, in India, on the West Coast. I run a consulting practice and I work in two areas, which is leadership development and organization development. That's a very corporate focused work. And the other side of the consulting piece is peace building. I happen to be a Rotary Peace Fellow, and that was the fellowship was hugely inspiring in terms of deepening my work in peace building. And the focus there is largely on peace education and dialogue. I think we're just about scratching the surface in terms of understanding what inclusive means, because particularly if I were to look at the corporate world, a lot of the focus initially began with the idea of diversity and the way corporates do a lot of things, diversity was metricized, and therefore it became about numbers of people recruited in the context of gender or age or race and other parameters. And then there was this conversation about saying, okay, we've got all of these people here. Now, how do we make them feel welcome? And a lot of inclusion became about that, right? Um, if I were to look at it, so my academic background is in psychology and in neuroscience, and I've also had a very deep interest in mythology around the world. And if I were to look at this from both those perspectives put together, to me, it feels like in order to build inclusive cultures, one needs to be very present to what kind of diversity are we really ready for. Because any market, any context that one lives and operates in, whether it's a corporate organization or an organization like Rotary or NGOs, I think the existing market, so to say, offers diversity naturally, right? That exists in any kind of an ecosystem that we work in. And therefore, uh, your organization or your team or your group is very likely to mirror that diversity in its own microcosm. But the point is to look at are we ready to truly work with that diversity, or do we take in that diversity and then try and train people into operating and thinking in a certain way, which then is not really inclusive, right? Because they're bringing in all these varied thought processes and uh, perhaps even emotional competencies and backgrounds. And then one is trained to say, hey, here's our culture, here are our sets of values, and here's how we operate. And that truly limits the idea of inclusivity. So, to me, I think the first step in creating an inclusive culture is to really think about what are we ready for. And if the current state of the organization and the way processes and even the purpose has been defined only allows for a limited amount of inclusivity, it's really essential to acknowledge that. And there's nothing wrong about it. And one can really gradually expand how much more inclusive we can be. But if we go about it by focusing on metrics and then get all this diversity in, and then we don't know what to do with it, that's not going to really create an inclusive culture. The systems change is essential, and that's essentially what this needs to lead up to. However, we can't only be working at the level of publishing policies and strategies, because yeah, we can make the most beautiful ones there and leave it there, and it exists on paper and nothing's done about it at the ground level, right? Because a lot of times people do not even bother to read up those beautiful papers. So it's, and at the end of the day, culture is lived and expressed by the people that embody that organization. So it's really essential that we support people in making these really quantum shifts in simple things, in the way they greet one another, in the way they address people at meetings, really simple things which eventually lead to a whole lot of shift in the culture. And that, of course, also means that we are challenging some people to shift their mindsets. And that can create conflict in the short run, but I would imagine that's healthy conflict. That's really essential for evolution of a system. Inclusion means different things to different people, particularly because all of us bring in our own traumas to any system that we work and operate in. And so the need of inclusion could express itself in very different ways. So it really helps to capture what does a particular person hope for when they are participating in this idea of an inclusive culture. And similarly, what are their apprehensions? Are there some things that really make them go, oh my God, no? Right. So, and it's important to document that. Those are valuable stories as well to capture. And then if you're able to analyze the larger narrative and look at what's emerging, that might be a good starting point to look at what are things we're really ready for and we could perhaps roll with, and what are things we need to make systemic changes around in a way that we could eventually address those fears and apprehensions, and then slowly start shifting policies, perhaps even processes and rituals over a period of time. But that really needs to be a gradual process, and I would also think it needs to be a trauma-informed process. Well, there's often this idea of separating and compartmentalizing our lives, right? So when I'm a Rotarian, I'm only a Rotarian. When I'm at work, I'm only that. And when I'm home, I'm only that. But at the end of the day, that's just a social role distinction. We can't quite leave behind parts of us when we enter a space. And so the trauma that we carry, which could be really personal in terms of things that have happened in our lives, or trauma that is very collective or even intergenerational. Right? For example, the fact that we're living in a world where a nuclear war is a possibility is collective trauma, and whether or not we're conscious of it, it does weigh on our minds. Or, for example, if I come from a community that's been historically marginalized or underprivileged, there is genetic memory that I carry, whether or not I happen to remember it. And there may be stories I've heard of my grandparents and so on. And that does have an impact on my psyche. And I can't quite divorce from that when I walk into a workplace. And so when we speak to people about what diversity means for them or what equity or inclusion means for them, what they're really answering from is how have they not been included, or how have they not experienced equity way back in the past? And a lot of it may not even be conscious memory. And they're bringing those in as needs. And so can we honor that and not really go by the words of it, because the words may sometimes not really capture all of it. I think one common mistake certainly is to focus a lot on the numbers, because that's really misleading and it doesn't really point at anything. Because what we're speaking about is something so intangible in terms of what people bring into organizations. So yes, numbers could be an indicator, but let's not really place too much weight just on them. I think it's essential to look at what are the kind of conversations we have in our very regular day-to-day kind of meetings, right? What are the work mechanisms? What are our policies and processes? And do they really invite people to bring in whole of themselves? Which means for example, that there's so much focus in a lot of organizations around extroversion, right? So people are asked to be expressive, to share their opinions, to participate in a certain way. And that does not quite allow for people who prefer a different form of expression. Perhaps they prefer to, visually create something and put their ideas across. Perhaps they prefer to write things over email and not really speak up in meetings. And that's not really appreciated. So it's really critical to look at how do we invite what people bring in. I'm thinking about how we hold the feminine and the masculine aspects of our psyche and how we've been trained in a patriarchal context to work with both of them. And if you were to look at least the last few centuries of how we've operated as a species, uh, the masculine aspect of ourself, and I don't really mean male, but the masculine aspect of every individual is expected to go out there, fight those wars, earn and bring in money and all of that. And the feminine aspect of self is the nurturer, the caretaker, right? And therefore also tends to do a lot of the emotional labor. And unconsciously, we've mirrored this even in our current systems, right? And therefore, all of these nurturing roles in an organization, including DEI, tends to be led by women. When we say nurturing roles, they also come with a lot of emotional labor. And which, in a way, also deepens patriarchy, if you ask me, because yes, one way of looking at it is to say, yes, over millennia, perhaps women have built this competency, although unconsciously, but they have built this competency and therefore they're able to hold space and do this work, which is great. And at the same time, is it really equitable that they're being asked to continue doing this work? Can we invite other genders to come into this space as well and contribute and learn in the process, which then also means we are asking for empathy from women while they support other genders to be able to come up to speed and nurture these competencies because they've truly not had the opportunity. Right? Because men, in being encouraged to embody the masculine the way they have been, have also been severely, they've had very severely restricted access to the feminine aspect of themselves. So even if they want to, and some of them genuinely try, it's a struggle because they don't have the vocabulary for it, they don't have the expression for it. And so it needs to be a patient process at every end to be able to make this happen over a long period of time. Similarly, if I would extend your example of women holding all of these spaces to also people from traditionally marginalized communities trying to be the voice of DEI across the world in various contexts because they feel the need the most and therefore they have no choice but to voice it. But can we also look at really conscious allyship? People who are in a more healed and a more privileged space have the responsibility of also healing that space, and therefore can they step up as well? I would think it's essential for any professional, young or old, to invest some time in learning the history of the communities that they work with. Because, a lot of conversation in a systemic context is around competencies and knowledge and skills, which people bring in. And a lot of the developmental conversation is also around those. But if one were to make an effort to look at what's the backgrounds, the cultures, and the traditions of the people that you work with, what's their mythology, which, whether they personally know of it or not, has an impact on their psyche. If people holding DEI spaces could learn of these, so learn a little bit of history, learn a little bit of mythology, that really helps in building empathy and building meaningful conversations. And of course, besides that, there's a whole lot of mechanisms around DEI which are already published and available, so one can always keep themselves up to date. It is your role, no matter who you are, whether your primary role is within a family, it's within a group of friends, it's in a large community or an organization, it is your role to build peace actively and to make the systems around you inclusive. And it could be through simple day-to-day measures that you could engage with. You could make sure that your personal practices are eco-friendly. You could make sure that you have conversations to genuinely get to know the people that you live or work with, uh, to honor their stories in whatever form is appropriate. Those are simple things that all of us could do on a day-to-day basis. And not participating is not an option. We belong in this world. Yes, by all means, a lot of us tend to go through exhaustion. Sometimes we just don't have the energy, and it's important to rest when one needs to, but remember that rest is part of the dialogue as well. We stop belonging in the world by doing nothing. Because if we are here, no matter what role and status it is, if we're here, then we're part of the world. We are part of the system. And even in our silence and even in our lack of action, we are contributing. And it's a matter of choice then, if you're contributing to something that need not be perpetuated and that's not equitable. Uh, if you exist in this world, you need to participate. It's as simple as that.